Let's go to your book, Lead Without Blame, Building Resilient Learning Teams. I think many people, when they read this title, maybe they could resonate with some of their work experience before. Maybe let's start with a simple question first. What is exactly blame in the terms of more philosophical, or maybe in your book when you mentioned about blame? What does blame mean actually?
Well, blame is the search for who caused a thing or how did something that we regard as not good, a problem, I mean, not just a problem to solve, but something that's causing difficulty or so on. And then looking around, deciding who's at fault or who should feel guilty about it, those kinds of things. What happens with that is that when that's our focus, rather than understanding what happened maybe systemically that contributed to that problem, that thing that's gone wrong, if we're only worried about who we can hold at fault, hold accountable for that, as opposed to what conditions are present in our system that allowed that to happen, that didn't prevent that problem in the first place, then it's a bad feeling to feel like you're being blamed. And then it often leads to feeling guilt and shame out of doing that thing. There's certainly bad things happen in the world, and certainly there are reasons to say, maybe you could do this differently next time, or so on, or even criminality. But that's not really usually what's going on at work. At work, there are a lot of factors at play, and we can't really distill that down to one thing that one person did. And if we do, we set up conditions where people spend as much or more energy avoiding being the person who's getting the blame and less on their time to be productive and creative and energetic. So blaming not only focuses us in the wrong place, but then it has a knock on effect where it de energizes, it disengages people because they spend their time not wanting to feel shamed, not wanting to feel blamed. So that causes a big problem in our system.
What you mentioned in your book as well, like when
Yeah.
people are getting blamed and the leader is
Yeah.
trying to find the so-called the culprit, right?
Yeah.
What mostly happen is that people tends to stop problem solving, tends to stop
Right.
thinking critically about what happened, and instead they go
Yeah.
into defensive mode. That's why probably creativity, innovation, productivity, and problem solving couldn't happen effectively.
Right.
So when we talk about blame, sometimes, yeah, it could be because individual reasons, maybe the
Right.
person's characters. But in your book, I find it interesting that you mentioned blaming is actually a habit. And this habit maybe unconsciously come
Yeah.
from a certain type of philosophical in terms of leadership. Can you tell us about why actually sometimes blaming is just a habit, that because it comes from a traditional leadership management
Right.
mindset?
Well, it comes from the idea that if someone is nearby when something goes wrong, then we should punish them for that somehow. And if you're the person who gets punished, you tend to internalize that. Oh, well, I must have done something bad. It's a very parental model in some ways. It's a model that comes from people not really understanding the impact of systems. I mean, Edwards Deming said systems drive behavior. It's not that a person has caused something to happen. And we even accept it for ourselves. We think, oh, I must have been the bad person. I must have done something wrong. But, what caused that to happen? There's a wonderful thing that we refer to in the book that comes from Norm Kurth's book, Project Retrospectives, a handbook of team reviews. He was talking about learning from experience after the end of a project or a big deliverable. He said, no matter what we discover, if we get together and we try to analyze what discover, we really want to assume that everybody was doing the best they could, given, so there's a lot of caveats here, given their skills and abilities. Were they assigned to the right project? Were they assigned a task that they were really prepared to do, that they had the background and the experience to do? Or were they given something like a stretch goal and they never had any chance? No matter how much of their good effort they put into it, there was no possibility of success. Or did they have the right information? Sometimes we get the wrong information and then we make our decisions, we take our actions, but it's based on wrong information. Well, where did that come from? Did we have the right resources and access to the right resources and decision making? And were we at our top condition? Were we well fed, well rested, feeling really fit to do the job? Or were we ill? All of those things are going to affect what the best we can offer that day is. And that's for everyone. We may have created for ourselves some standard of what we can stretch into when we do our absolute best and everything else is working well, but we can't expect that to happen all the time. Mistakes will happen. People will make mistakes, but generally that's going to be based on some conditions outside that person. I've been working in this field for a very long time, and I have never come into a workplace that treated its people well and so on, where somebody said to me, I think I'll do a bad job today. I came to work this morning and I just think I'm just going to choose to do a bad job. Nobody's doing that, right? Everyone is saying, I'm going to give it my best today. So if you're working on a team, you can make some choices about how work gets assigned or who's working together. I think highly collaborative teams where everyone's backing each other up, it's much less likely that a problem is going to happen in teams like that because you've got backup, you've got bench strength, we say in baseball. You've got that kind of opportunity for someone else to step in and help. There's a story that we talk about in the book that came out of Etsy about a young person that worked at Etsy and got assigned to be the on-call person over the weekend. I mean, I'm really shortening up this story. You can look it up online and get more detail. But something happened. That person took an action and trying to make things better, and something really awful happened. The whole site went down or something like that. But what that person did, because they felt like it was a safe environment, they made sure to get in touch right away and say, oh my gosh, this thing happened. And then other people were able to come in and help. And the president or senior executive in that organization gave that person an award. They said not only did they let everybody know right away when something went wrong, the system was at fault for putting them in that vulnerable position where they didn't have all the skills and knowledge that they needed to take care of the things that they were put in charge of, and said, this is great. You've showed us a hole in our system that we need to fix. So he got congratulated. I'm sure it must have been very mixed emotions in that person on that day. But that's when you don't have an environment or culture of blame and shame. If he had been in a culture that was full of blame and shame, he probably would have tried to hide the fact that something went wrong. He would have concealed that he wasn't really quite up to the job or whatever. So I just think it's a huge difference when we have one stance versus the other stance.
Yeah, I even read this part of the book where you mentioned about Etsy giving awards quite frequently for people who make mistakes. I mean, this is not just random normal mistakes, but something that
Right.
is highly unanticipated. It's not
Right.
like something like we do it carelessly, but
Yeah.
Etsy is trying to find people who make mistakes unintentionally without anticipation, of course, and then learn from that experience. When I read
Right.
the book, it's like, wow, this is so different culture.
Yeah.
Because in the world, when this happened, for example, incident happened, on-call incidents happened, the system went down. Obviously, leaders will try to be accountable. That's the first thing, because
Right.
they want to do a great job as a team and try to look for the so-called who caused this. And you mentioned this is because leaders want to be accountable. Maybe they were
Right.
not part of the activity themselves. And maybe that is the thing that actually caused them to become in this blaming mode, right?
Yeah.
So tell us about how we should avoid trying to be accountable and trying to find something that caused the issue.
Well, it really is about thinking more broadly than just an individual thinking and learning to do systems thinking, for one thing. When we look for a single point of failure, we need to also look for what else is going on in that context that had not let that single point of failure be visible before. I mean, there's not a problem with looking for where is the place that this happened? Why did this happen? That's all good investigation. But it's when you take that investigation and turn it into blaming rather than, oh, this is an opportunity for learning. We've just uncovered something we didn't realize was possible before. That's an opportunity for learning. And when leaders support that, they get much better outcomes. If they spend their time trying to find the person to blame, it not only affects that person. This is the interesting part. It not only affects that one person that is being blamed, but everybody else that blame is visible to now thinks, oh, I better watch out. I better be careful. I better not take any chances. I must play it safe all the time because otherwise I will get blamed the next time if something goes wrong. And what does that do to the creativity of people in the system? I don't want to take any chances. I don't want to take any risks. I'm only going to do what's tried and true and safe because otherwise I might get blamed for something because I saw this other person and they got blamed. So it doesn't just translate to the one person who may has the finger pointing at them, but it translates across to everybody they work with. That's now a message that's going out. And that's part of why it becomes such a big problem.
Yeah, I think you mentioned this very, very accurately.
Yeah.
When it becomes like a signal for others, right? Okay, this person got blamed because of this. I may not want to do the same thing and maybe be quiet and avoid
Right.
some kind of risky situations, like being afraid to be in that position as well, right? Because being blamed is not nice, definitely. Personally, you feel like helpless. You also feel like your self-worth is kind of like being challenged there.
Yeah.
So I think leaders out there, you should be very cautious before you actually trying to blame somebody. For myself, sometimes I can also go into this kind of tendency, but what helps me, like what you mentioned, the prime directive, the retrospective prime directive, always try to maybe read that in your mind before you actually say something to someone or the team so that you get into this more like finding the systemic cause rather than the individual cause of the problem.